A lot has happened over the past weeks in the space rocket industry, and the biggest question on everyone's mind is when will SpaceX launch its first Starship orbital flight? Unfortunately, we have to wait a little longer, as Elon Musk just revealed that the SpaceX Starbase launch debut is delayed. Instead, SpaceX's best trampoline has successfully completed its mission, bringing the crew of 5 astronauts back home safely. For the rest of the space world, one of the most important rocket companies, United Launch Alliance (ULA), may be sold later this year. Relativity Space also failed to launch Tauran 1, and there's much more to discuss. Let's start with a Starship update. SpaceX is now targeting April for the first orbital launch. We're getting close to our first orbital attempt of a Starship. Hopefully in the next month or so, we'll have our first attempt. Elon Musk shared this at the Morgan Stanley 2023 Technology, Media and Telecommunications (TMT) conference on March 7th. I'm not saying it'll get into orbit, but I am guaranteeing excitement. We may no longer be able to count how many times this flight has been delayed. In this case, the company's decision to install a massive water deluge system to protect Boca Chica's launch pad from the enormous heat and pressure of the Super Heavy BN-7 booster's 33 engines firing all at once may have played a role in the most recent delay. SpaceX crews have also been installing shields to protect piping, control panels, and other equipment in and around the orbital launch mount. They have also been affixing the last thermal tiles to the 6-engine Starship SN-24 that will sit atop the Super Heavy for the flight. Electronic navigational buoys that the company will use to cordon off a wide area of the Gulf to marine traffic during the flight are already on site at Boca Chica and waiting to be deployed. Most importantly, SpaceX is awaiting federal approval to launch Starship. SpaceX has not yet received that license from the FAA to launch Starship. The federal agency completed a lengthy environmental review of the proposed test in June of last year and gave SpaceX more than 75 actions to mitigate environmental impacts related to the flight. The FAA will make a license determination only after the agency is satisfied that SpaceX meets all licensing, safety, and other regulatory requirements. An FAA spokesperson said in an email, "We are reminded of this over and over." Notably, on February 17th, the FAA issued a $175,000 fine against SpaceX for failing to submit required data for a Falcon 9 mission in August of 2022. The agency is alleging that SpaceX did not submit launch collision analysis trajectory data prior to the mission, which sent a batch of Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit. That data is needed to assess the probability of a spacecraft colliding with one of the thousands of tracked objects orbiting Earth, according to an FAA notice. It was the first time the FAA proposed a civil penalty for a rocket operator failing to submit data before a launch. SpaceX was given 30 days to respond to the FAA's notice, and this definitely needs to be resolved before the FAA makes the final decision on the Starship flight. Indeed, this is a very difficult program. I'm not saying it'll get to orbit, but I am guaranteeing excitement, so it won't be boring, said Musk. I think it's got, hopefully above 50% chance of reaching orbit. Musk also mentioned that he believed Starship has an 80% chance of reaching orbit this year. While SpaceX has been making progress with their Starship program, other rocket companies have also been making headlines. One of the biggest news in the space industry was the announcement that United Launch Alliance (ULA) might be sold later this year. ULA is a joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Boeing and is one of the most important rocket companies in the world. The sale could potentially have a significant impact on the space industry as a whole, and many are eagerly awaiting to see what the future holds for ULA. Another interesting development was the failed launch of Tauran 1 by Relativity Space. Tauran 1 was the first orbital launch attempt for the company, which has been developing 3D-printed rockets. The rocket suffered an anomaly and was destroyed during the launch, but the company has vowed to learn from the experience and improve their technology for future launches. In addition to these news, there have been ongoing developments in the space industry, including the exploration of Mars by NASA's Perseverance rover, the growing interest in space tourism, and the increasing involvement of private companies in space exploration. SpaceX has had a busy year with their 17th launch of 2023, marking the 16th for their Falcon 9 rocket. The Cargo Dragon spacecraft was filled with fresh food, hardware, and experiments for the International Space Station. The spacecraft lifted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida and is expected to dock with the ISS for a month-long mission. SpaceX plans to carry out up to 100 missions this year, making them the hero of the space industry. Although SpaceX has not yet launched their Starship, their accomplishments are prominent, especially as United Launch Alliance (ULA) is up for sale. The sale of ULA, which has lasted nearly 2 decades, would mark the end of an era. The company was formed in 2005 as a part of a deal brokered by the US government to ensure the military had access to both Atlas and Delta rockets to put national security satellites into space. Lockheed Martin and Boeing merged their launch businesses into a single company, with each taking a 50% stake. ULA held a monopoly on launching national security missions and effectively NASA science probes, but in return for 100% mission success, ULA received large launch contracts and approximately $1 billion in annual subsidy from the US Department of Defense to maintain launch readiness. The emergence of SpaceX in the early 2010s with the increasingly reliable Falcon 9 rocket disrupted this profitable arrangement. SpaceX sold the Falcon 9 rocket at a substantial discount to ULA's Atlas V and Delta IV rockets. The company also successfully sued the US government to allow the Falcon 9 rocket to compete for national security missions and launched its first one in 2017. SpaceX now dominates ULA in terms of cadence, launching as many rockets each month as ULA launched during a whole year. In recent years, SpaceX has landed more rockets than ULA has launched during its entire existence. Not only ULA, but new rocket company Relativity Space is also experiencing challenges. The startup attempted to launch the world's first 3D printed rocket, the Terran 1, on Saturday, March 11th, but it was cut short by 2 different aborts amid weather and range safety delays. Despite 3 attempts, the company was unable to launch the rocket after suffering 2 last-minute aborts, including one that fired up its engines and one hauled when the boat encroached in an offshore safety zone. Relativity Space's Terran 1 rocket is a prototype for a larger, fully reusable launch vehicle named Terran R. About 85% of the rocket is 3D printed at the California-based company's Long Beach factory, with only components like rubber gaskets, computer chips, and valves as non-3D printed parts. The Terran 1 uses liquid methane and liquid oxygen or methane ox fuel, and is the first US orbital rocket aiming to reach orbit on such a mix. It is designed to carry payloads up to 1,250 kilograms to low Earth orbit for $12 million per flight. If the Terran 1 succeeds, Relativity Space will use its 3D printing technique to build the larger Terran R, which is expected to lift payloads up to 22,000 kilograms into orbit. SpaceX continues to make waves in the space industry with its successful launches and dominance over ULA. Meanwhile, Relativity Space is pushing the boundaries with their 3D printed rockets and the promise of a fully reusable launch vehicle. The space industry is ever evolving, and it will be exciting to see what the next months hold.